In the hills south of San Francisco, behind wrought iron gates and beneath ancient oaks, lies one of America's most beautiful estates, FILOLI. 56 rooms, 16 acres of formal gardens. A name derived from a personal creed: fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man, live a good life. Every year, more than 400,000 visitors walk these grounds. They admire the symmetry of the sunken garden, the precision of the Irish yews, the elegance of a house that seems to embody everything the Gilded Age aspired to be. But beneath the beauty lies a more complicated story. The man who built FILOLI was called a thief and a scoundrel by his own city's newspaper. He controlled the water supply of San Francisco during its most desperate hour. He built his fortune on the labor of men who worked 10-hour shifts 1,000 feet underground. And yet, this same man was decorated by the French government for his humanitarian work during the First World War. He was praised by Herbert Hoover as one of America's finest citizens. He named his estate after ideals of justice and love. This is the story of William Bowers Bourne II, a man of contradictions, a builder of paradise on stolen water, and the estate he left behind. Please subscribe and like this video if you enjoy my content. Now, let's dive into it. Chapter 1: The Suicide on Nob Hill. The story of FILOLI begins not with construction, but with destruction, not with a birth, but with a death, and not in the gentle hills of Woodside, but on Nob Hill in San Francisco in the spring of 1874. William Bowers Bourne Sr. had done everything right, or so it seemed. He had arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush, one of thousands of young men drawn west by the promise of fortune. But unlike the miners who broke their backs in freezing rivers, Bourne understood that the real money was not in finding gold. It was in selling things to the men who searched for it. He started with a small merchandise business, then dry goods. Then, as his capital grew, he moved into the business that would define his family's future: mining investments. By the 1860s, Bourne Sr. had acquired a controlling interest in the Empire Mine in Grass Valley, about 60 miles northeast of Sacramento. It was one of the oldest and deepest hard rock gold mines in California. The kind of investment that could make a family wealthy for generations, or destroy them entirely. For a time it seemed to promise the former. The Empire Mine made Bourne Sr. rich enough to build a mansion on Nob Hill, that exclusive summit where the railroad barons and silver kings constructed their palaces. Rich enough to move in the finest circles of San Francisco society. Rich enough to give his children every advantage that money could provide. He and his wife Sarah had 4 children. The eldest was William Jr., born in 1857. Then came Frank, 2 years younger, and 2 daughters, Sarah and Ida. It should have been a golden life, and for a time it was. But in 1872, tragedy struck the family for the first time. Young Frank, just 10 years old, died from injuries sustained in a fall. The details have been lost to history, but the grief was permanent. Sarah Bourne, the mother, never fully recovered, and neither, it seems, did her husband. In the years following Frank's death, the Empire Mine began to falter. The easy gold near the surface had been extracted. The deeper veins were harder to reach, more expensive to work. Costs mounted, returns diminished. William Bourne Sr., who had built everything on this single investment, watched his fortune begin to slip away. By 1874, the situation had become critical. The mine was struggling, debts were accumulating. The mansion on Nob Hill, that symbol of success, had become a monument to financial anxiety. On the morning of May 5, 1874, William Bowers Bourne Sr. was found in the bathroom of his Nob Hill home. He had been shot. A revolver lay nearby. The San Francisco Chronicle reported it as suicide. The coroner's initial inquest seemed to confirm this conclusion. A man under financial pressure. A family already scarred by the death of a child. The gun in his own hand. But then something unusual happened. A second inquest was called. And this time, the verdict was different. Accidental death. What changed between the first inquest and the second? The historical record is frustratingly incomplete. Perhaps new evidence emerged. Perhaps the family's social standing influenced the proceedings. Suicide carried tremendous stigma in Victorian America, affecting not just the deceased's reputation, but the family's standing in society and even their insurance claims. What we know for certain is this: William Bowers Bourne Sr. was dead at the age of 51. His widow Sarah was left with a failing mine, mounting debts, and 3 surviving children. The eldest son, William Jr., was just 17 years old and 3,000 miles away, studying at Cambridge University in England. The telegram that reached him in the spring of 1874 contained news that would change the course of his life. His father was dead. The family's fortune was in jeopardy. The Empire Mine, that hungry, expensive, increasingly unproductive hole in the ground, was now his responsibility. Most 17-year-olds, faced with such news, might have panicked. Might have sold whatever could be sold and tried to salvage what remained of the family's wealth. Might have retreated into the comfortable anonymity of a modest inheritance, however diminished. William Bowers Bourne II did none of these things, at least not immediately. He remained at Cambridge for 4 more years, completing his education. He studied, he waited, he planned, and in 1878, at the age of 21, he finally returned to California to face his inheritance. What he found was a mine that experts said was finished, a fortune that experts said was lost, a future that experts said held nothing but decline. The experts, as it turned out, were wrong. Chapter 2: Digging Deeper Than Anyone Dared. When William Bourne arrived at the Empire Mine in 1879, he found a disaster. The shafts had flooded. Water seeped through the rock faster than the old pumps could remove it. The ore at 1,200 feet, the deepest anyone had dug, was exhausted. The Ophir vein, which had made his father wealthy, appeared to have surrendered its last secrets. He was 22 years old. He had a family name and a mine that appeared worthless. He did something unexpected. He reorganized the company, formed the original Empire Mill and Mining Company, and announced that he intended to dig deeper. Below 1,200 feet, into depths that California miners had never attempted. But he could not do it alone. He needed men who understood hard rock mining at levels that exceeded anything attempted in the American West. He needed technology that did not yet exist in California. He found both in Cornwall. For over 1,000 years, the men of Cornwall in southwest England had been mining tin and copper from the earth. Generation after generation, they had developed techniques for going deeper, for pumping water, for surviving underground. When word spread that California needed hard rock miners, the Cornishmen came. They brought their skills. They brought something called the Cornish pump, a steam-powered engine that could remove 18,000 gallons of water per day from flooded shafts. With this single innovation, the Empire Mine could be drained and reopened. By 1890, the population of Grass Valley was 85% Cornish. The Empire Mine's labor force was 90% Cornishmen, men who called each other Cousin Jack, and understood rock in ways that American miners did not. William also made another decision in 1881. He hired his 19-year-old cousin, George Starr, to work as a mucker, the lowest position in the mine, shoveling broken rock into ore cars. George Starr had talent. Within 6 years, he worked his way from mucker to miner to shift boss to superintendent of the entire operation. He introduced compressed air drills in 1890, a full decade before most competitors adopted the technology. He modernized extraction methods. He made the Empire famous among engineers worldwide. Under Starr's management and Bourne's capital, the shafts pushed past 1,200 feet, past 2,000, past 3,000. Each level revealed new veins of gold. The gamble had worked. William Bourne had transformed a flooded failure into one of the most productive gold mines in California. But triumph and exploitation were inseparable. The Cornish miners who made Bourne's fortune worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They earned $3 a day. The compressed air drills that Starr introduced created clouds of rock dust that filled the tunnels with silica particles. The miners breathed this dust year after year. Many developed silicosis, a lung disease that slowly destroyed their ability to breathe. There was no treatment. There was no compensation. In 1888, an explosion tore through the surface buildings. 2 men died. The blast destroyed the blacksmith works and carpentry shop, damaged the main hoist, and shattered every window in the mill. The disaster sparked the first labor unionization in Grass Valley. Tensions between workers and management would continue for decades. In 1907, the miners struck for an 8-hour workday. In 1919, they struck again for a $1 per day raise. The San Francisco newspapers celebrated William Bourne as a captain of industry, a man who had defied the skeptics and built an empire from a flooded hole. They did not write about the men who coughed blood in boarding houses or the widows who received nothing when their husbands died underground. By the early 1900s, William Bourne was one of the wealthiest men in California. The Empire mine had made him rich beyond anything his father had imagined, and with that wealth came an opportunity to control something even more valuable than gold: the water supply of an entire city. Chapter 3: The Water Tyrant. In 1860, a man named George Ensign incorporated a company called the Spring Valley Water Works. Within 5 years, it had absorbed every competitor and established a monopoly over San Francisco's water supply, a monopoly that would last for 70 years. The company's methods were brutal. Armed with the power of eminent domain, Spring Valley's owners forced the sale of private land at a fraction of its value. They acquired over 100,000 acres of watersheds across the peninsula. They hired engineers who also consulted for the same financiers who owned the company, ensuring that every infrastructure decision benefited the same small circle of men. By the 1910s, Spring Valley was the largest privately owned water utility in the United States. It was also despised. San Francisco residents paid 24 cents per 1,000 gallons. Residents of Los Angeles, served by a city-owned utility, paid 10 cents. The difference was not subtle. Families struggled with water bills while shareholders collected dividends. The San Francisco Chronicle made Spring Valley executives a regular target, depicting them in editorial cartoons as villains squeezing money from ordinary citizens. William Bourne saw opportunity in this hatred. In 1906, an earthquake devastated San Francisco. At 12 minutes past 5 on the morning of April 18th, the San Andreas Fault shifted. Buildings collapsed, streets buckled, and beneath those streets, the water mains shattered. The earthquake killed hundreds. But it was the fire that destroyed the city. Broken gas mains ignited blazes throughout downtown. Firefighters rushed to hydrants and discovered that no water came out. The system that Spring Valley had built to serve 400,000 people had failed at the moment it was needed most. For 3 days, San Francisco burned. The fires consumed more than 25,000 buildings. When the smoke cleared, over 80% of the city lay in ruins. More than 3,000 people were dead. Spring Valley had not caused the earthquake. But the failure became a symbol. The city began planning a new system that would bring water from the Hetch Hetchy Valley, 160 miles away, bypassing Spring Valley entirely. With the company's stock price devastated and its future uncertain, Bourne bought a controlling interest in 1908 and became president. The Chronicle responded by calling him a thief and a scoundrel for his water rates. Bourne replied that the company deserved a reasonable return on its investments and was planning for future population growth. The argument convinced no one who paid a water bill. What made Bourne's position particularly striking was his apparent indifference to public opinion. In 1906, the same year as the earthquake, he commissioned the architect Willis Polk to design a water temple in Sunol, where 3 subterranean pipelines converged. The temple was modeled after an ancient Roman structure. It featured 12 Corinthian columns and a terracotta roof. It was, by any measure, beautiful. A man who builds temples to water while being called a water thief is either supremely confident or supremely tone-deaf, perhaps both. For 2 decades, Bourne fought the Hetch Hetchy project and defended Spring Valley's rates. he extracted every possible dollar from San Francisco's water supply until the city finally purchased the company in 1930 for nearly $40 million. By then, he had already built his greatest monument, not a temple, but an estate. The land for that estate came from Spring Valley's holdings, 654 acres in the hills of San Mateo County. Company land, water company land. He would name it FILOLI. Chapter 4. Building the Dream. Willis Polk was not an easy man. He had declared bankruptcy in 1897. He swung a cane through the streets of San Francisco, smoked cigars, played banjo, and once had himself hoisted on a steel girder 10 stories above Market Street to evade arrest by a building inspector. A contemporary described him as having the eyes of a very wicked wild squirrel. He was also by 1915 among the most influential architects in California. His buildings included the tallest skyscraper in San Francisco, the glass-curtain Halidi building that would shape modern architecture for decades, and a series of elegant Georgian mansions for the city's wealthiest families. Polk had been designing buildings for William Bourne since 1896, when he created the Bourne Mansion on Webster Street in Pacific Heights. The following year came the Cottage at the Empire Mine, a summer retreat constructed from waste rock pulled out of the mine itself. The two men understood each other. Polk knew how to translate Bourne's ambitions into brick and stone. Bourne knew how to pay. In 1915, Bourne commissioned something grander than anything they had attempted, a country estate on 654 acres at the southern end of Crystal Springs Lake. The land belonged to Spring Valley Water Company. Bourne was building his private retreat on property that his own corporation controlled, property assembled through decades of eminent domain seizures and aggressive acquisition. Whatever the newspapers said about his water rates, whatever the editorial cartoons implied about his character, he would construct his answer in architecture. Not a defense, a declaration. He was 58 years old. His only son had died one day after birth, more than 3 decades earlier. His daughter had married and moved to Ireland. Agnes, his wife of 34 years, wanted a country home where they could entertain without the pressures of San Francisco society. Bourne wanted something more. He wrote that he intended to devote the afterglow of his life to personal supervision of the estate's development. There, he told a friend, he hoped to grow young. The site he chose sat in a sheltered valley beneath coast redwoods and oaks, with views extending across the reservoir to the hills beyond. A creek ran through the property. The setting was ideal for the English country house he envisioned. It was also located almost directly on the San Andreas Fault. Bourne knew this. He built anyway. Polk designed reinforced foundations capable of withstanding seismic activity, adapting Georgian formality with practical California elements. A Spanish tile roof instead of slate, stucco walls suited to the climate, classical proportions engineered for unstable ground. The result was a mansion that belonged to both worlds, English tradition reimagined for the western edge of a continent. Construction employed more than 100 workers over 3 years. The project exceeded its budget, ultimately costing $425,000, equivalent to $8 or $10 million today, and that figure covered only the house itself. When the Bournes finally moved in during the fall of 1917, the building contained 56 rooms, 10 principal bedrooms, 17 fireplaces, quarters for 14 staff, a ballroom designed for concerts, and a transverse hall that established the axis around which everything else would be organized. Bourne named it FILOLI. The word puzzled visitors until Bourne's assistant solved the mystery. It was an acronym derived from the first 2 letters of each phrase in Bourne's personal credo: fight for a just cause, love your fellow man, live a good life. A man who had spent 4 decades fighting for gold and water, whose relationship with his fellow man had produced labor strikes and newspaper denunciations, had named his estate after ideals of justice and love. Whether this represented aspiration, self-deception, or something more complicated, Bourne never explained. What he had built required no explanation. The house rose from its valley with the confidence of old money, though the money was barely a generation old. Willis Polk had created something that would outlast any argument about its owner, a monument that invited admiration regardless of how its construction had been financed. Bourne intended to spend the rest of his life here, supervising the development of gardens and grounds, entertaining friends, growing young in the California sun. The gardens would take another 5 years to complete, and Bourne would have far less time than he imagined. Chapter 5. The Estate. The house and gardens at Filoli were conceived as a single composition. Willis Polk oriented the mansion so that the main axis extended through the building and into the landscape beyond, where the gardens would descend the gentle slope in a sequence of outdoor rooms. For the garden design, the Bournes turned to Bruce Porter, not a landscape architect by training, but an artist whose talents ranged from stained glass to murals to sculpture. Porter had never designed anything on this scale, but he understood proportion and light and the relationship between structure and space. He established the bones of the garden, the walls, the hedges, the axial paths, the way each enclosed space would open onto the next. His inspiration came from Italian Renaissance models, geometric formality adapted for the California climate. For the plantings, Porter collaborated with Isabella Warren, a horticulturist whose family had deep roots in Marin County. Her grandfather, James Ross, had arrived during the gold rush and acquired a Mexican land grant. The town of Ross bears his name. In 1888, Isabella and her sisters had started a floral design business in San Francisco, creating arrangements for the city's wealthiest families. She understood color, seasonality, and the particular demands of clients who expected perfection. At Filoli, she translated Porter's structural vision into living plants, selecting species, and establishing the color schemes that would define each garden room. The work proceeded between 1917 and 1922. When complete, the formal gardens covered 16 acres. The first major space below the house was the sunken garden, a rectangular lawn surrounded by clipped hedges with twin olive trees flanking a reflecting pool at its center. The pool held 8,000 gallons and was planted with water lilies. On still mornings, the house appeared twice, once rising from its foundation, once inverted in the water below. The irony required no explanation. The president of Spring Valley Water Company, the man who charged San Franciscans premium rates for every gallon, had built an estate where water existed purely for beauty. The reflecting pool served no practical purpose. The fountains that would later be added served no practical purpose. The irrigation that kept the lawns green through California's dry summers served no practical purpose except to demonstrate what unlimited access to water could create. Beyond the sunken garden, the landscape unfolded through distinct spaces. The walled garden with its geometric beds arranged around a central axis. The Chartres Cathedral Garden, named for hedges trimmed to echo the shape of Gothic windows, the woodland garden where cultivated plantings gave way to native oaks. Each room offered different colors, different light, different moods. A visitor could spend hours moving through these spaces, but Filoli was designed to function as well as impress. Behind the formal gardens lay working areas where vegetables and cut flowers were grown for the household. The staff of 14 required feeding, the dinner parties required centerpieces, the house required constant supplies of fresh blooms to fill its many rooms. Isabella Warren oversaw these practical concerns as carefully as she oversaw the ornamental displays. The estate extended far beyond the cultivated areas. The full 654 acres included forests of coast redwood, groves of oak, open meadows, and the creek that had attracted Bourne to the site. Trails wound through this wilder landscape, offering escape from the formality of the gardens into something closer to the California that existed before men with money arrived to reshape it. By 1922, the essential work was complete. The house and gardens functioned as Bourne had envisioned, a unified composition where architecture and landscape reinforced each other, where old-world formality met new-world abundance, where a fortune extracted from gold and water had been transformed into something that aspired to permanence. William Bourne was 65 years old. He had built exactly what he set out to build. But in August of the previous year, something had happened that would redefine his relationship to this place he had created. He had suffered a stroke, Chapter 6. The Hero Nobody Expected. In August 1914, William Bourne was in England when the guns began. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo had set off a chain reaction across Europe, and by August 4th, Britain had declared war on Germany. Bourne found himself in London at the worst possible moment, along with roughly 100,000 other American tourists who had been enjoying the summer on the continent. The tourists were stranded. Banks would not honor their letters of credit. Ships had stopped crossing the Atlantic. Hotels filled beyond capacity. At the Savoy, a makeshift relief operation took shape in the lobby and corridors. The man who organized it was a 40-year-old mining engineer named Herbert Hoover. Bourne knew Hoover. Both had roots in the California mining world. Hoover had started his career in Nevada County, not far from the Empire Mine, and the two men had crossed paths before the war. Now they worked side by side in the chaotic offices at the Savoy, processing paperwork, arranging loans, securing passage on whatever vessels could still make the crossing. Bourne called Hoover the greatest American alive today. The assessment proved prescient. Hoover would go on to lead the Commission for Relief in Belgium, serve as food administrator under Wilson, and eventually become president. After the immediate crisis passed, Bourne returned to California. But he could not forget what he had witnessed. The scale of the war, the devastation already being reported from Belgium and France, the incomprehensible slaughter at the front, these things demanded a response. Official American policy was neutrality. Bourne believed this was wrong. He gathered his wealthy friends, members of the Pacific Union Club, men with resources and influence, and formed an organization called Friends of France. William H. Crocker joined. So did Porter Garnett. The group raised money for humanitarian relief and lobbied openly for American intervention. In November 1915, at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, the great fair Bourne had helped finance to celebrate San Francisco's recovery from the earthquake, he delivered the principal address at a ceremony honoring France. The man who had been called a thief and a scoundrel by the Chronicle stood before thousands and shouted a question. "Is America neutral?" The crowd roared back, "No!" It was an extraordinary moment. Here was a capitalist who had profited from monopoly, whose water company charged San Franciscans premium rates, whose miners worked long shifts underground, and he was positioning himself as a champion of international justice. The same newspapers that had attacked him as a robber baron now reported his speeches with approval. Bourne did more than give speeches. Working with Professor Charles Mills Gailey of the University of California, he helped organize the American League of California to support the Allied cause. But their most significant contribution was helping to send young men to war. The American Field Service was recruiting volunteer ambulance drivers, college students who would drive Ford ambulances at the front, ferrying wounded soldiers from the battlefield to aid stations. These volunteers needed funding. They had to provide their own equipment and expenses before the Army would accept them. Joseph Houston Eastman, a Stanford junior, began organizing recruitment on campus. His brother Samuel worked for Bourne in San Francisco. When Joe appealed for help financing the volunteers, Bourne responded. At Berkeley, Professor Gailey took the campaign to Harmon Gymnasium, where he repeated Bourne's question to the assembled students. Is America neutral? 110 young men volunteered that day. By April 1917, when America finally entered the war, 4 corps of California recruits were ready to ship out. Friends of France hosted a farewell banquet at the Palace Hotel. Days later, 12,000 people gathered at the San Francisco Civic Center for a send-off ceremony. 2,500 Berkeley students marched from the Ferry Building. 1,000 came from Stanford. The volunteers served at Verdun in Champaign on the Chemin des Dames. They drove through artillery barrages and gas attacks, carrying the wounded through shell-torn roads. Some received the Croix de Guerre for gallantry. Some did not come home. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. On July 30, 1920, William Bourne was made an officier of the Légion d'honneur for his service to France during the war. He was also awarded La Reconnaissance Française, a medal given to only 38 Americans. The San Francisco Chronicle reported the honors without irony. The man they had once caricatured as a water thief had become a decorated humanitarian. The contradictions in his character had not resolved. They had simply expanded to encompass new territory. Bourne was 63 years old. He had built an estate, preserved a gold mine, monopolized a city's water, and helped send young men to fight for France. The French government had recognized him. The newspapers had softened. His place in California history seemed secure. But the stroke he had suffered the previous summer had already changed everything. The man who had once climbed down mine shafts and crossed oceans now moved through Filoli in a wheelchair. The afterglow he had imagined, decades of personally supervising his estate, of growing young in his private paradise, would look very different from what he had planned. He would spend the next 15 years watching from the windows. Chapter 7. The Irish Connection. We have already seen that William Bourne's daughter married an Irishman and moved across the Atlantic, but the story of how that marriage came to shape two estates on opposite sides of the world deserves telling in full. Arthur Rose Vincent was a British colonial judge traveling home from Shanghai when he met Maud Bourne on an ocean liner. He was 33, from an Anglo-Irish family based at Summerhill House in County Clare. He had served in East Africa, Zanzibar, Siam, and China, moving through the outposts of empire as a young man with a law degree from Trinity College Dublin and ambitions that exceeded his salary. By the standards of his class, he was respectable, but not wealthy. Maud was 26. What passed between them on that voyage is lost to history, but by the time the ship reached San Francisco, something had been decided. On March 30th, 1910, they married at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in San Mateo. William Bourne faced an immediate problem. His new son-in-law was posted to Zanzibar. Bourne's solution was characteristically direct. He purchased Muckross House and its surrounding 11,000 acres on the lakes of Killarney in County Kerry. The price was £60,000. He presented the estate to the newlyweds as a wedding gift. Arthur resigned from the Foreign Office. Zanzibar's loss was Ireland's gain. Muckross was a 65-room Tudor mansion built in the 1840s, set on a peninsula between two of Killarney's famous lakes. Queen Victoria had stayed there in 1861, an event that had nearly bankrupted the previous owners, who spent lavishly to prepare for the royal visit. The estate included ancient oak forests, mountain views, and some of the most celebrated scenery in Ireland. For the Bournes, Muckross became a second home. They crossed the Atlantic regularly, spending months at a time with their daughter, son-in-law, and eventually two grandchildren, Elizabeth Rose, born in 1915, and Arthur William Bourne, born in 1919. The influence flowed both ways. When Filoli was being planned, Muckross provided the model. The Georgian style adapted for California, the relationship between house and landscape, the sense of a self-contained world, these elements drew directly from what the Bournes had experienced in Ireland. But the most tangible connection stands in the gardens today. The Irish yews that line the alleys at Filoli, more than 200 of them, their dark columnar forms punctuating the landscape, were grown from cuttings taken at Muckross. The Bournes brought the cuttings to California and nurtured them at the Empire Cottage in Grass Valley before transplanting them to Filoli. Every visitor who walks between those trees walks through a living link to County Kerry. Between 1911 and 1932, the Vincents invested over £110,000 improving Muckross, sunken gardens, rock gardens, landscaping that transformed the grounds. The two estates developed in parallel, an American fortune reshaping landscapes on opposite sides of the world. Arthur Vincent became a figure in Irish life. He served as High Sheriff of Kerry in 1915. During the turbulent years of independence and civil war, he navigated the transition from British rule to the Free State, eventually serving in the Seanad. For Maud, Muckross was home in a way California never quite was. She had found in Ireland a life that suited her. Lady of a great estate, mother to two children, wife to a man who had chosen her over his career. The crossings continued, but her heart remained at Killarney. She was 46 years old in February 1929 when she boarded a ship bound for California to visit her father. She would not survive the voyage. Chapter 8. The Prisoner of Paradise. The stroke came without warning. One moment William Bourne was at the Empire Cottage in Grass Valley, the house Willis Polk had built for him decades earlier, surrounded by the mine that had made his fortune. The next moment he was on the floor, his body no longer answering his commands. It was August 1921. Bourne was 64 years old. He survived, but the damage was severe. A second stroke followed in October 1922, and after that there was no question of recovery. The man who had descended into mine shafts, crossed oceans, built an empire of gold and water, would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Bourne was a proud man. He could not bear the thought of being seen in his diminished state. At FILOLI, the gardeners received instructions. When Mr. Bourne was being wheeled through the grounds, they were to stay out of sight. The staff learned to disappear into hedges and behind walls when they heard the wheelchair approaching. The master of the estate had become invisible even on his own property. Most mornings, weather permitting, Bourne asked to be taken to the high place, the elevated point at the southern end of the garden where the ULA terminated. From there he could look down over the formal gardens, across the meadows, to Crystal Springs Lake in the distance. It was the best view on the property, and it was all he had left of the active life he had planned. The afterglow he had imagined, 40 or 50 years of personally supervising the estate's development, of growing young in his private paradise, had lasted exactly 4 years. By 1924, it was clear that Bourne would never travel again. He would never return to Muckross, never see his grandchildren in Ireland, never walk the paths he had helped create at Killarney. Agnes, watching her husband's anguish, proposed a solution. If William could not go to Ireland, Ireland would come to him. They commissioned Ernest Peixoto, an American artist known for his mural paintings, to capture Muckross on canvas. The contract was signed in October 1924 for $25,000. Peixoto would paint 5 large murals for the ballroom, transforming the grandest room at FILOLI into a permanent vision of the Irish estate Bourne could no longer visit. There was one complication. Peixoto had never seen FILOLI. He traveled first to Muckross, where he spent months with his family, sketching the house, the lakes, the mountains, the light that fell across the Killarney landscape. He captured O'Sullivan's Cascade, the view across Muckross Lake, the estate itself rising from its gardens. Then he returned to his New York studio to paint the murals on enormous canvases. To ensure the paintings would fit the space he had never entered, Peixoto built a maquette, a detailed miniature model of the FILOLI ballroom, constructed from the architect's plans. He painted tiny versions of his murals onto the walls of this dollhouse-sized room, adjusting proportions and compositions until everything worked in harmony. The maquette passed down through his family for decades. No one realized what it was until years later, when Peixoto's descendants watched the film Heaven Can Wait and recognized the ballroom on screen. The murals were installed in 1925. Bourne could now sit in his wheelchair in the 70-foot-long ballroom and see Ireland surrounding him, the lakes, the mountains, the house where his daughter lived, the landscape he had come to love. It was a magnificent gesture and a heartbreaking one. The paintings remain there today. That same year, Bourne made another gesture toward a future he would not share. He commissioned architect George Washington Smith to design a Spanish Revival mansion in Pebble Beach for Maud, a California home where she could stay when visiting from Ireland. He called it Asilo, meaning refuge. The house was completed in 1924, waiting for a daughter who would never grow old enough to need it. The business empire began to contract. In 1929, Bourne sold the Empire Mine to Newmont Mining Corporation. The mine that had started everything, the property his father had invested in and he had rescued from ruin, passed out of family hands forever. The gold continued to flow. The empire would operate until 1956, but Bourne no longer cared. His daughter had died that February, and nothing else seemed to matter. The parties continued at FILOLI, but the Bournes no longer attended them. Agnes had developed diabetes in 1932 and was confined to her bedroom at the north end of the house. William remained in his rooms. His sisters hosted the gatherings, maintaining appearances for a household whose owners had effectively withdrawn from life. The last dinner party the Bournes gave was on November 24, 1933, a celebration of the repeal of Prohibition, which guests called the Drunk's Dinner. Bourne's sister Ida served as hostess. William and Agnes stayed upstairs. For nearly 15 years after his first stroke, William Bourne lived as a prisoner in the paradise he had created. He could see the gardens from his windows. He could be wheeled to the high place to watch the light change over the lake. He could sit in the ballroom surrounded by paintings of a country he would never visit again. Fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. The credo still applied, but living it had become something very different from what he had imagined. Chapter 9. 4 Graves on a Hill. The telegram arrived at Filoli in February 1929. Maud was dead. She had been crossing the Atlantic with her 2 children, traveling from Ireland to California to visit her ailing father. Somewhere on that voyage, the same journey she had made dozens of times before, she contracted pneumonia. By the time the ship docked in New York, she was gravely ill. On February 12th, she died. She was 46 years old. Her body was placed on a train and carried across the continent to California. At Filoli, preparations began for a burial that no one had imagined would come so soon. William Bourne, confined to his wheelchair, watched as workers climbed the small knoll west of the house, a bare hillside with clear views across the valley to Crystal Springs Lake. There they created a cemetery for his daughter. The grave marker would be a Celtic cross, a copy of the one standing in the ruins of Muckross Abbey in Ireland. Even in death, the 2 estates would be connected. The infant son who had died one day after birth in 1882 was exhumed from wherever he had been buried and moved to join his sister. The Bourne family cemetery now held 2 graves. Before long, it would hold 4. The losses that followed Maud's death came in rapid succession. Within months, Bourne sold the Empire Mine to Newmont Mining Corporation. The gold mine that had started everything, the property his father had invested in and he had rescued from ruin 40 years earlier, passed out of family hands. The following year, the city of San Francisco finally purchased the Spring Valley Water Company, the monopoly Bourne had controlled for 2 decades, the source of so much wealth and so much criticism. The sale had been coming for years, ever since the city began building the Hetch Hetchy system. But now, Bourne no longer cared to fight. In 1932, the Bournes and Arthur Vincent made a decision about Muckross. The estate had become too expensive to maintain, too painful to visit, too full of memories of the woman who had made it a home. They offered the property to the Irish government as a memorial to Maud. The gift was extraordinary. 11,000 acres of some of the most beautiful landscape in Ireland, including the house, the gardens, the lakes, and the mountains beyond. It became the Bourne Vincent Memorial Park, the first national park in the Irish Free State, the foundation of what would grow into Killarney National Park. The estate that William Bourne had purchased as a wedding gift for his daughter would belong to the Irish people forever. Arthur Vincent was appointed to the Seanad in 1931. He remained in Ireland for several more years before eventually moving to Monaco, where he would spend most of the rest of his life. He is buried at Killigee, a small graveyard near Muckross, where the Celtic cross erected by the Herbert family's tenants overlooks the estate he once called home. At Filoli, the household contracted around its diminished occupants. Agnes had developed diabetes in 1932 and was confined to her bedroom. William remained in his wheelchair, attended by staff, visited occasionally by his sisters. The parties continued. His sister Ida served as hostess, but the Bournes no longer attended. They had withdrawn from the life of the house they had built. On January 3, 1936, Agnes Moody Bourne died at Filoli. She was 75 years old. She had been married to William for 54 years, since that ceremony in Yonkers in 1881 when they were both young and the future seemed limitless. William survived her by 6 months. On July 5, 1936, he died at Filoli at the age of 79. He had outlived his son, his daughter, and his wife. He had watched his empire dissolve, the mine sold, the water company sold, the Irish estate given away. He had spent his final 15 years as a prisoner in the paradise he had created, unable to walk, unable to travel, able only to sit in his wheelchair and look out at the gardens and the lake beyond. They buried him on the knoll beside Agnes, Maud, and the infant son who had never been given a chance to live. The Celtic cross, copied from the one at Muckross Abbey, stood watch over them all. Fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. The credo remained, carved into the meaning of the estate's name. But the family that had given it meaning was gone. In 1981, Maud's daughter Elizabeth Rose, the granddaughter who had been born at Muckross in 1915, was buried in the family plot. The born line at Filoli had ended. The house stood empty, waiting for someone else to give it purpose. Chapter 10. The Gift. The house stood empty for only a few months. In the final days of 1936, a newspaper in San Francisco reported an extraordinary real estate transaction. William P. Roth, president of Matson Navigation Company, and his wife Lurleen had purchased Filoli for $225,000. The Roths were among the few families in the Bay Area who could afford such an acquisition. The Depression had devastated most of the old fortunes, but the Matsons were shipping magnates, and shipping had survived. Lurleen Matson Roth was the daughter of Captain William Matson, a Swedish immigrant who had built one of the largest shipping fleets on the Pacific. She had been named after one of her father's vessels, a brigantine called the Lurleen that once carried cargo between California and Hawaii. Her husband had risen to lead the company her father founded. When they moved into Filoli in early 1937 with their 3 children, 21-year-old William and 17-year-old twin daughters Lurleen and Berenice, they brought with them the same combination of wealth and ambition that had built the estate in the first place. The pattern repeated itself in uncanny ways. Like William born before him, William Roth would suffer a debilitating stroke. His came in 1943, and like Agnes Bourne had done for her husband 2 decades earlier, Lurleen adapted the property to accommodate his limitations. A swimming pool was added in 1946 for his rehabilitation, the same remedy the Bournes had never thought to try. The pool became a gathering place for the family, its blue water reflecting the gardens that surrounded it. Lurleen threw herself into the gardens with the same passion that had driven the Bournes. She sought out Isabella Warren, now elderly but still sharp, and persuaded her to return to Filoli. The woman who had helped create the original gardens continued to advise on their expansion until her death in 1950, at the age of 81. Under Lurleen's direction, the gardens grew. Camellias multiplied, rhododendrons spread across the woodland, azaleas bloomed in colors the Bournes had never imagined. A screened tea house appeared. The 16 acres of formal gardens became a living collection, constantly evolving. The Roths entertained lavishly. Amelia Earhart visited in 1937 and took Lurleen for a plane ride over the estate, just months before the aviator disappeared over the Pacific. The Polish pianist Ignacy Paderewski performed in the ballroom where Ernest Peixoto's Irish murals still hung on the walls. In 1939, the twin daughters made their debut at a party so extravagant that newspapers reported they had been launched into society like luxury liners, an apt metaphor for the shipping heiresses. William Roth died in 1963 at the age of 83. Lurleen was 73 years old. She could have sold the estate then. She could have moved to something smaller, easier. Instead, she stayed. Alone in the 56-room house, she continued to tend the gardens, continued to improve them, continued to share them with visitors from botanical societies and garden clubs around the world. In 1973, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal of the Garden Clubs of America. 2 years later, at 85 years old, she made a decision that would shape Filoli's future forever. A buyer had been found for the estate. But when Lurline learned that the new owners would not allow public access, that the gardens she had nurtured for nearly 4 decades would be closed to visitors, she refused to complete the sale. Instead, she donated Filoli in its entirety to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, along with an endowment of $2.4 million to ensure its maintenance. "Filoli is too beautiful to be private," she said. The estate opened to the public in 1975. Lurline Matson Roth died a decade later on September 4, 1985, one day after her 95th birthday. She had outlived her husband by 22 years and had spent those years ensuring that the house William Bourne had built would belong to everyone. The cameras arrived almost immediately. In 1978, Warren Beatty filmed Heaven Can Wait at Filoli, jogging through the gardens in the opening scenes. The movie was nominated for 9 Academy Awards. 3 years later, the estate appeared in the opening credits of Dynasty, the television soap opera that would define 1980s excess. Every week, millions of viewers watched a helicopter shot sweep over the gardens and the Georgian facade, though they knew the house only as the Carrington Mansion. The show ran for 9 seasons. Films followed: The Joy Luck Club, The Game, The Wedding Planner. The estate that William Bourne had built to escape public scrutiny had become one of the most photographed properties in America. Today, more than 400,000 visitors walk through Filoli's gardens each year. They photograph the Irish yews that grew from cuttings brought from Muckross. They admire the sunken garden with its pool of water lilies. They stand in the ballroom beneath Ernest Peixoto's murals and try to imagine what it felt like to be William Bourne, confined to his wheelchair, gazing at painted images of an Ireland he could no longer visit. On November 15, 2023, President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping met at Filoli for 4 hours of talks during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. They walked through the gardens where the Bournes had once strolled, where the Roths had raised their children, where Amelia Earhart had walked before climbing into her plane and disappearing into history. The meeting was broadcast around the world. Fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. William Bourne's credo endures, carved into the very name of the place he created. The empire he built is gone. The gold mine sold, the water company absorbed, the Irish estate given to another nation. His wife and daughter and infant son lie buried on the hillside beneath a Celtic cross. But the house remains. The gardens flourish. And every year, hundreds of thousands of people come to Filoli to walk the paths he planned, to sit in the rooms he furnished, to stand where he stood and look out at the hills of California. He hoped to grow young there. He grew old instead, watching from his wheelchair as the years slipped away. But the beauty he created has outlasted him. It has outlasted his family, outlasted his fortune, outlasted even the memory of his name for most of the visitors who pass through its gates. That perhaps is legacy enough.